An old yellow school bus, its engine sputtering laboriously, crawled along the muddy gravel road, taking us deeper and deeper into the heart of the Louisiana swamps. The inscription, University of New Orleans, Department of Veterinary Medicine on its side, looked as out of place here as a tuxedo at a fishing trip. The air, thick and humid like a hot compress, pressed down on our lungs, and even Mark Riley, our unofficial leader and eternal optimist, was worn out. His jokes about 10-foot water moccasins and man-eating alligators, which he tried to cheer us up with, drowned in the ominous silence, broken only by the deafening, monotonous chirping of cicadas. I, Sarah Jenkins, gazed out the window at the endless wall of cypress trees, their branches, like bony hands, draped with strands of Spanish moss, and an inexplicable anxiety gripped my heart with icy fingers. The trees themselves watched us, ancient and malevolent. "Almost there, guys." Mark checked the map on his tablet. "Crescent Moon Ranch should be just around that bend." The bus bounced over another pothole and turned, revealing a sight that made even Ben Carter, our resident joker, whistle. Crescent Moon Ranch, though the name hardly fit, consisted of several dilapidated, peeling sheds and a yard overgrown with waist-high weeds. The main house, a two-story structure of darkened wood, looked relatively sturdy, but it exuded a palpable sense of desolation that sent shivers down my spine. It stood on a slight elevation, like a grim sentinel gazing out at the murky waters of the bayou beyond. On the porch, we were met by the owner. Jedediah Turner, or just Jed as he later introduced himself, was a tall, almost emaciated old man. His figure was like one of those cypress trees, bony, gnarled. His faded, almost colorless eyes watched us with a deep, ancient weariness in which lingered a hidden pain. "You're here." His voice was as dry and creaky as the old boards of the house itself. A nod of his head completed the greeting. Not a hint of a smile, not a drop of hospitality. Jed led us into the house, which smelled of dampness, dust, and a subtly unpleasant, stale, ancient mustiness. The instructions were short and to the point. "Work with the livestock from dawn till dusk. You'll take samples, run tests, all as arranged with your professor. After dark, everyone stays in the house, and not a single soul goes near the old barn by the swamp's edge." Here his voice hardened, becoming menacing, and his gaze pierced each of us. "There's rot in there, snakes, and the floor will give way under your city feet. The last thing I need is to pull one of you out of that hole." He handed Mark a bundle of old, rusty keys to our rooms and the tool shed. "Settle in. Dinner's on your own." We were given 2 adjoining rooms on the second floor. The furnishings were stark to the extreme. Narrow iron beds with thin mattresses, a rickety table, and a couple of chairs. Cobwebs hung in garlands in the corners, and the ceiling dripped in one spot, leaving a dark stain on the floor. Ben cracked a few jokes about a 5-star hotel with an exclusive swamp view, but his optimism quickly faded under the oppressive atmosphere. Emmy Chen, our quietest and most impressionable expedition member, nervously looked around, clutching her cardigan despite the suffocating heat. I walked over to the window. It overlooked the forbidden barn, a dark, squat structure almost entirely hidden by overgrown bushes and overhanging willow branches. A chill and a latent threat emanated from it, even from a distance. After a brief setup, Mark and Ben went to inspect the grounds. Emmy and I stayed behind to unpack the equipment in our makeshift lab, which we set up in one of the rooms. There weren't many livestock on the ranch. A dozen skinny cows and a couple of equally scrawny steers who shied away from any sudden movement. The pastures were sparse, enclosed by old, partially rotted fencing. Beyond them began a dense, almost impenetrable forest, transitioning into marshy bogs. Further on, as far as the eye could see, stretched the dark, motionless surface of Bayou Creek, gleaming under the low sun. Returning an hour later, Ben looked agitated. "Sarah, Mark, look at this. What the hell is this?" He called us to the far edge of the pasture where he'd been checking the fence. On the damp ground, next to a fallen fence post, there were tracks. Huge, deep. They definitely didn't belong to a cow or a human. The tracks resembled wolf prints, but their size was twice that of the largest wolf print I'd seen in pictures. The fingerprints, though the name hardly fit, were strangely elongated, almost human-like, but ended with distinct indentations from unnaturally long, sharp claws. I knelt down, examining them. A chill ran down my spine. This was something abnormal. Mark approached and silently studied the prints for a moment, then scoffed skeptically. "Local folklore come to life? Some Rougarou decided to take a stroll?" He tried to joke, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "It's just some local prank, trying to scare the newcomers. Or maybe a very large coyote with an anomaly in its paws. Given the proximity to the swamps and the isolated population. Anyway, don't worry about it, Ben." But I saw him glance at the tracks one more time before turning away. We proceeded with our duties, taking blood samples from the frightened cattle, checking feed, recording data. Jed barely participated in the process, only appearing silently, like a shadow here and there, observing us with his faded eyes. His presence was almost palpable, like an additional layer of humid, heavy air. Dinner, consisting of our canned goods and bread, passed in oppressive silence. We sat at the large kitchen table, illuminated by a dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Jed ate slowly, barely looking at his food, and answered our rare questions monosyllabically, with short, clipped phrases. His gaze often drifted to the window, which overlooked the yard, towards the forbidden barn, now swallowed by the deepening twilight. For a moment, fear flickered in his eyes, immediately hidden. I shivered, despite the stuffiness. This trip promised to be much more challenging than a usual field practicum. As soon as the sun vanished behind the cypress tops, plunging the ranch into the inky southern night, the swamps came alive. The deafening chorus of cicadas and frogs penetrated the walls, mixing with the distant hooting of owls and the splashing of water. But through this usual cacophony of the region, other sounds soon began to break through. Sounds that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. They came from the direction of the forbidden barn. First, it was a low, drawn-out howl, full of such longing that my heart tightened. Then the howl gave way to a furious, guttural growl that made the windows in our room vibrate. We heard the scraping of claws on wood, long, powerful claws, tearing splinters from the old boards. And then came dull, heavy thuds. A huge, heavy body slamming against the walls from the inside, trying to break free. Emmy, pale as a sheet, pressed herself into her pillow, covering her ears. I, on the other hand, held my breath and listened, and with every passing minute my apprehension grew, turning into a sticky, cold dread. In the morning, over cold coffee and stale bread, we couldn't talk about anything else. What the hell was that? Ben nervously tugged at the edge of his shirt. Mark, trying to maintain his composure, shrugged, but his eyes betrayed his unease. "Old boards, wind blowing, cat-sized rats. Normal for abandoned places like this," he said, though none of us believed him. "Maybe an alligator got in, or a wild boar." When we cautiously asked Jed about the night sounds, he merely shrugged his bony shoulders indifferently, like I said, rot. Animals crawl around there. Not your business. His answer was as inscrutable as his expression. The night sounds repeated every night, growing louder, more ferocious. The howl turned into a bone-chilling roar. The banging on the barn walls became so violent that the old structure threatened to collapse at any moment. Curiosity in us, especially in Ben and Mark, flared up with renewed intensity, mixing with fear. They suspected Jed was keeping a large animal in the barn, illegally caught or sick, and his strict warnings were merely a way to hide it from us. I, however, leaned towards a darker version. The old man was conducting cruel experiments on stolen animals. The thought made me nauseous. On the third night, when the moon was hidden by thick, heavy clouds, and the sounds from the barn reached their climax, a furious roar, scraping, and desperate gurgling screams, Mark couldn't take it anymore. "Enough guessing," he whispered as we sat in our room, unable to sleep. "Let's go and see." "Jed's sleeping like a log," I checked. "The light in his room hasn't been on for a while." Ben enthusiastically supported the idea. He had a small set of lockpicks with him, just in case, as he'd put it. I hesitated. Fear gripped me, but the desire to know the truth, to see what or who was making these monstrous sounds, outweighed it. We were convinced that an animal was suffering in there, and as future veterinarians, we were obligated to intervene. Emmy flatly refused, burying herself under the covers and muttering something about us all being crazy. And so the three of us, Mark with a heavy army flashlight, its beam nervously darting across the yard, Ben with his tools clinking in his pocket, and I, with a pounding heart, tiptoed towards the barn. The night was muggy and still. The air here, right by the barn, was especially heavy, saturated with the smell of dampness, rotting straw, and a sharp, musky, almost nauseating animal smell that made my throat itch. The barn door was secured with a massive wrought iron bolt, and additionally wrapped with a thick, rusty chain and a huge, antique padlock that, judging by its appearance, hadn't been opened in decades. Ben fumbled with the lock for a while, but it wouldn't yield to his picks. "It's old, damn it, and strong as a bank vault," he whispered in frustration. "Needs a crowbar, not these toys." Then he began examining the walls and soon found what he was looking for, a wide crack between the dried, cracked boards of the wall, large enough to peek inside. "Over here," he called us in a whisper. "Just be careful." Mark dimmed the flashlight beam with his palm and directed it into the crack. Inside the barn, pitch blackness reigned. The faint light picked out scraps of old straw on the dirt floor, remnants of some ropes hanging from the beams, and suddenly the beam froze. In the far corner, in the thickest shadow, we saw movement. Something. A huge dark silhouette, crouched low, hunched to the ground. It was breathing heavily, raggedly, emitting a quiet, gurgling sound, a growl or a moan. It was impossible to distinguish details. Too dark, too far. But its very presence radiated a primal threat that froze my blood. It was something alive, enormous, and undoubtedly suffering or enraged. Or both simultaneously. My breath caught in my throat. "What in hell are you doing here, puppies?" A sudden bright beam from another flashlight blinded us, and Jed's creaky, furious voice rang out. The old man stood just a few steps from us, between the barn and the house, dressed in the same clothes he'd worn all day. In his hands was an old double-barreled shotgun, and the barrels, though not pointed directly at us, were at the ready. His face, illuminated from below by our flashlight, was contorted with such fury that I was genuinely terrified. His eyes burned with a cold fire. "I told you not to come near here," he snarled. "I warned you nicely." Muttering incoherent apologies, we hastily retreated into the house, feeling his heavy, piercing gaze on our backs. I didn't turn around, but I was sure he was still standing there, shotgun in hand, guarding his terrible secret. That night, the sounds from the barn were quieter than usual, almost inaudible. But this silence was even more terrifying. The next day passed in an oppressive, almost unbearable atmosphere. Jed barely spoke to us, only occasionally casting malevolent, piercing glances our way. Mark tried to apologize for the night's escapade, but the old man cut him off mid-sentence with a sharp, "Do your work and mind your own business." Last night, after our intrusion, the sounds from the barn had been surprisingly quiet, almost absent. This only added to the mystery and heightened our suspicions. Our curiosity had somehow affected whatever was hidden there. By noon, when the sun was directly overhead and the heat became almost unbearable, Emmy, who was checking water samples from the watering trough in the far pasture, let out such a piercing, blood-curdling scream that we all rushed to her. The scene that greeted our eyes was a nightmare. One of the cows, the very one whose blood I had drawn yesterday, lay on its side in a pool of its own blood, its eyes glazed and filled with terror. Its throat was literally ripped to shreds, and its side torn open with huge, ragged wounds, exposing ribs and internal organs. Around it, on the flattened grass, were signs of a desperate struggle. The ground was churned up, bushes broken. The sight was so brutal and bloody that even Mark, the most resilient of us, gasped, and Ben turned away, barely suppressing a retch. As future veterinarians, having seen our share of unpleasant things in practice, we nevertheless forced ourselves to approach and examine the carcass. "It's not a cougar," I said confidently, pointing to the depth and nature of the wounds. My pulse hammered in my temples. "The teeth marks are too large, not positioned like a feline's. And the claws. Look at these gouges." I pointed to deep scratches running across the skin and muscle. Something with incredible inhuman strength tore the flesh. And look at these paw prints around it, in the mud by the creek. Again, the same ones Ben had found by the fence, only here they were even clearer and deeper. Definitely not a cougar, and not a bear? Something else? The tracks were enormous, with 5 digits and long claws, and again that strange, almost human-like arrangement of the toes. Jed, who had come at Emmy's scream grimly without any surprise, examined the remains. "Cougar," he muttered curtly, avoiding our gaze. His face was a stone mask, but I noticed his chin tremble. "Or stray dogs from the swamps, completely wild. Happens in these parts. Hungry, that's why they attack." But his voice sounded utterly unconvincing, and in the depths of his faded eyes, a poorly concealed fear, almost panic, flickered for a moment. He was lying. He wasn't telling the whole truth. While Jed, groaning, loaded the cow's remains onto an old rusty wheelbarrow to bury them far away so they don't attract other beasts, I secretly took several photos of the wounds and tracks with my phone. The quality of the pictures wasn't the best, but it was something. I also, trying not to attract the old man's attention, collected several samples of hair caught on the thorny bushes near the attack site. The hair was coarse, almost like wire, dark brown, almost black, and completely unlike the hair of a cow or any known predator in the area. I hid the bag of hair in my pocket. That evening, locked in our room, we held a war council. Emmy was still shaking, barely speaking, just clutching her blanket despite the stuffiness. Mark still tried to find a rational explanation for what had happened. An unusually large black bear wandered down from the mountains, or an unknown disease causing aggression in local predators. But his confidence waned with every word. Ben put forward the theory that Jed was hiding a dangerous exotic animal in the barn, a smuggled one, which had escaped and killed the cow. He's starving it in there, that's why it went wild, he speculated. I shared my observations about the atypical wounds and the strange hair showing the photos on my phone. Those tracks, they're almost like human footprints, but with claws, I murmured, zooming in on the image. And that strength, to tear a cow apart like that. My voice trembled. The thought swirling in my head was too wild, too incredible to voice. That night, the sounds from the barn resumed with new, terrifying intensity. It was no longer just a howl or a growl. It was a furious roar, full of pain, malice, and a primal longing. Powerful thuds shook the barn walls, and even the floor in our room slightly vibrated. We didn't sleep, listening with bated breath, not daring to even stir. The creature locked in the barn possessed incredible strength and ferocity, and it was hungry, very hungry. I lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about the tracks, the hair, the wounds on the cow's body, and about the fact that tomorrow was the full moon. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead. In the morning, Jed was even more sullen and taciturn than usual. At breakfast, which consisted of yesterday's leftovers and bitter coffee, he announced without looking at us that he urgently needed to go to the nearest town. A couple of hours' drive one way if the road isn't completely washed out, for parts for a broken water pump and some special feed. I'll be back by night. His voice was dry and lifeless. Keep things in order here. And as for the barn, he paused, sweeping a heavy gaze over us, don't go near it. Understood? His words sounded like a command and a veiled threat. As soon as his old, rattling pickup roaring its engine disappeared around the bend in the road leading to civilization, Mark turned to us. A determined fire burned in his eyes. "This is our chance," he said firmly. "We have to find out what's in that damn barn and what's really going on here. I can't pretend everything's okay anymore." This time, we were better prepared. Ben, rummaging through the tool shed, which Jed had carelessly left unlocked, brought a small crowbar and a heavy hammer. The barn lock, the same one that hadn't yielded to Ben last night, looked formidable, but rust had significantly corroded it. A few precise, powerful blows with the crowbar to the shackle, and it gave way with a screech. The chain fell to the ground with a dull clang. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. Mark pushed open the heavy door. Inside the barn, a dim light filtered through cracks in the walls and a couple of boarded-up windows. Heavy, stagnant air hit our noses with a mixture of ammonia, dried blood, rotting straw, and that same sharp, musky animal dread. Disappointment and even more questions awaited us. The barn was empty. No huge beast, no chains to hold it. But the traces of its recent presence were everywhere and horrifying. The walls inside were deeply scratched with long gouges, as if giant claws had been dragged across them. Several thick beams reinforcing one of the corners were snapped clean off or torn out by the roots as if they were matchsticks. In the center of the dirt floor, remnants of a powerful metal chain were visible, one end of which was embedded in a homemade concrete block, the other broken off, torn out with monstrous force, leaving a ragged hole in the concrete. Whatever had been here possessed incredible, destructive power. I took sample bags from my backpack, which I had foresightedly brought from the university kit. Carefully, trying not to miss anything, I began to inspect the barn. I found several more tufts of the same dark brown, coarse hair stuck in splinters on the walls. On the floor, among the straw, I discovered several broken claws. They were black, curved, resembling eagle talons, but much thicker and longer, an inch and a half long at least. On the floor and the lower parts of the walls, numerous brown stains, undoubtedly dried blood, were visible. I carefully collected all the found samples into bags, labeling each. Mark, meanwhile, methodically photographed everything with his phone. The scratches on the walls, the broken beams, the torn-out chain, the bloodstains. "If it's not here, then it's outside somewhere," Ben muttered, nervously looking around. "Or Jed hit it." "He couldn't have moved a creature like that unnoticed," Mark countered. "So it escaped on its own." The thought made me shiver. We decided that Jed was hiding something in the house as well and headed there. We began our search in the old man's bedroom. It was as ascetic and miserable as the rest of the house. A narrow bed covered with a worn blanket, an old dresser, and a chair. Nothing interesting. But next to his room was another door, locked. Ben picked the old, simple lock with his tools. The room we entered turned out to be a child's room. Long abandoned, covered in a thick layer of dust that danced in the air and the rays of light filtering through the grimy window. A small, ridiculously short wooden crib with peeling paint. A shelf by the wall cluttered with faded, broken toys, a plush bear with a torn ear, a couple of wooden blocks, a rubber ball, a small drawing table, and a matching chair. On the wall, above the crib, hung several faded, yellowed photographs in simple frames. One of them showed Jed, significantly younger than now, even almost smiling. Beside him stood a pretty young woman with kind eyes, and between them, a small boy of 5 or 6, with a mop of dark hair and mischievous, laughing eyes. He was tightly holding his parents' hands. On the drawing table lay a stack of children's drawings done with colored pencils. Most of them were ordinary, childish scribbles. A crookedly drawn sun with a smile, a house with smoke coming out of the chimney, some absurd animals. But one drawing, lying on top, made me freeze and feel a chill run down my spine. It depicted the same boy from the photograph, but his smile here seemed somehow eerie, almost predatory, unnatural for a child. And beside him, almost embracing, stood a huge black wolf. The wolf was disproportionately large, taller than the boy, with burning yellow eyes and bared fangs. One of its massive paws with black claws rested possessively on the boy's shoulder. Below, in clumsy childish letters, was written, "Billy and his friend." I felt nausea rise in my throat. Billy. That was the boy's name in the photograph. And this friend. We didn't have time to properly discuss what we had seen. The crunch of gravel on the driveway made us jump. Jed was back, much earlier than we expected. We barely managed to slip out of the nursery, closing the door, and pretended that we were just inspecting the house while waiting for his return. The old man entered, scowling and suspicious, his faded eyes drilling into us one by one. He said nothing, but I knew he suspected something. That evening, over a meager dinner of our remaining provisions, Jed had forgotten about the special feed. The atmosphere in the house was strained to the breaking point. The tension hung in the air, thick and heavy, like swamp fog. I couldn't take it anymore. Looking at the almost full moon, shining brightly through the window, I quietly uttered, more to myself, "Tomorrow is the full moon." Jed sharply looked up at me. In his eyes, for one short, elusive moment, a genuine panic flared, which he immediately tried to hide behind his usual grim mask. Ben scoffed, "Oh, don't start with those old werewolf stories, Sarah. We're scientists, not horror movie protagonists." But Mark noticed how the old man's hand, holding his fork, trembled, and how he swallowed convulsively. That night passed surprisingly quietly. No sounds from the barn, only the usual incessant chorus of the swamp's night inhabitants. Frogs croaking, insects chirping, the distant cry of some bird. But this lull was far more frightening than all the previous furious sounds. We didn't sleep, lying in our beds and listening to every rustle, waiting for the terrible, inevitable. The moon, almost full, enormous and cold, bathed the ranch and the surrounding swamps in its silvery, deathly light. It was a night of waiting, the calm before the storm. The morning of the full moon greeted us with a heavy, leaden sky. Thick clouds threatened to break into a storm at any moment, though no thunder was heard. The air was sticky, still, and somehow particularly oppressive. Jed had been restless since dawn. He paced back and forth in the yard like a caged animal, muttering to himself, constantly glancing at the sky, then at the empty barn, then towards the swamps. He paid little attention to us, completely absorbed in his grim, anxious thoughts. His face, already haggard, was even grayer and more drawn today. We noticed him meticulously checking the locks on all the doors and windows of the house, even those on the second floor. He dragged rusty nails and a hammer from somewhere and boarded up several boards crosswise on one of the old shed windows, the one adjacent to the barn. Then he took his old double-barreled shotgun and a box of cartridges from the pantry. He carefully and meticulously wiped the rifle with an oiled rag, his movements slow and ritualistic. To our cautious questions, he answered irritably and curtly, "Just precautions. All sorts of evil crawls out of the swamps on a full moon. You never know." But his voice carried a poorly concealed fear. With the onset of darkness, the real nightmare began. As soon as the last rays of the sun disappeared below the horizon, and the full moon, enormous and crimson, peeked out from behind torn clouds, a howl echoed from the swamps. A long, soul-chilling howl, unlike any we had heard before. In it, bestial rage mingled with an almost human agony and a primal longing. This howl silenced even the cicadas and frogs. And then, almost immediately, came the heart-rending squeals and moans of the cattle, the sounds of breaking pen boards, the crunch of bones, and the sickening tearing and sucking of flesh. It lasted for several minutes that felt like an eternity. We sat in the main room, paralyzed with horror, unable to move. Something's happening to the cows. Mark finally choked out, the first to come to his senses. Primal fear constricted our limbs, but we, Mark, Ben, and I, ran outside. Emmy, pale as death, remained in the house, huddled in a corner, covering her ears. The scene that met our eyes in the deathly light of the full moon, piercing through ragged clouds, and in the trembling beams of our flashlights was apocalyptic. Jed's entire small herd, what was left of them, had been torn apart with monstrous, unimaginable cruelty. The ranch yard had turned into a true slaughterhouse. Blood was everywhere, on the ground, on the barn walls, on the grass. Mutilated carcasses lay in unnatural poses. The smell of fresh blood and death was so strong it made my head spin. "Jed, Mr. Turner!" Mark shouted, his voice trembling with horror and disbelief. There was no answer. We scurried around the yard, stepping over animal remains, trying to find the old man, but he was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, from around the corner of the house, moving with unnatural, animalistic speed and terrifying grace, a huge, dark figure burst out. It was not a wolf or a bear, but its size surpassed either of them. The creature moved on two powerful, muscular hind legs, slightly hunched over. Its long, strong front limbs, resembling arms, ended in enormous black claws, about 5 inches long, glinting in the moonlight. Its elongated wolf-like snout with rows of razor-sharp teeth was smeared with blood. And its eyes burned in the darkness with a bright yellow, almost phosphorescent fire, full of primal rage and inhuman hunger. It was a werewolf. The very friend of Billy from the child's drawing, only now it was real. And it was here. Before we could react, before we could even scream, the creature, with one lightning-fast leap, was next to Ben, who stood slightly ahead, closest to the corner of the house. With one monstrous swipe of its massive clawed paw, it knocked him down like a bowling pin. There was a short, gurgling cry immediately cut short, and a sickening wet crunch of breaking bones. I saw Ben's head jerk unnaturally. The werewolf, letting out a low, triumphant growl, seized Ben's limp, instantly lifeless body by the leg, and as easily as a rag doll, dragged him into the darkness towards the swamps from which it had appeared. Everything happened in a matter of seconds, impossibly short seconds. Seconds that would be etched in my memory forever. Mark and I froze for a moment, paralyzed by horror. Blood pounded in my ears, the world narrowed to this nightmarish scene. A piercing, desperate scream from Emmy in the house brought us back to reality. She had seen everything from the window. As if on cue, we bolted towards the house. I vaguely remember running to the porch, how Mark flung open the door. I only saw Emmy's face distorted by terror, her wide, insane eyes. Mark shoved both of us inside, and with inhuman effort amidst the growls and scratching of claws coming from very close by, pushed the heavy oak dresser in the hallway, barricading the door. We were trapped. Locked in. Outside, just a few feet from us, was the monster that had just brutally killed our friend before our eyes. And it knew we were here. The silence that followed the massacre in the yard and the furious sounds at the door was deafening, unnatural. I, Mark, and Emmy sat in the main room of the house, huddled together on the old, worn sofa, unable to utter a single word. Emmy was silently crying, her body trembling with a fine tremor. Mark, pale but trying to keep his composure, stared blankly at the barricaded door. I felt a cold terror gripping my entire body, but my brain frantically tried to find a way out. Then, from outside, came a heavy, raspy snort, the breathing of a huge beast with congested lungs. After that, the scraping of claws on the wooden siding of the house. It was there. The creature walked around the house, slowly, sniffing the walls, the windows, sometimes letting out a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold and my hair stand on end. Shadows of its enormous silhouette slid behind the thin, dusty curtains on the windows, appearing and disappearing. It was toying with us like a cat with a mouse, savoring our fear. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Emmy, huddled in the corner of the sofa, was no longer crying, but quietly moaning, rocking back and forth. Mark jumped up and began frantically pacing the room, peering into every corner, pulling out drawers of the old sideboard, searching for any kind of weapon. The finds were meager. A couple of long kitchen knives with serrated blades, a heavy poker by the long cold fireplace, and an old rusty splitting axe he found in the closet under the stairs. "Something at least," he mumbled, clutching the axe handle. I, though scared to death, tried to think rationally. "We have to contact someone somehow," I whispered, trying to keep my voice from trembling. "Jed's phone? Maybe he has a satellite phone?" But we knew perfectly well there was no mobile service at the ranch, and the nearest town with a landline phone was hours away by rough road. We were cut off from the world. The siege continued. The creature didn't leave. We heard it forcefully pushing the wooden shutters on the first-floor windows, scratching under the door, trying to slide its clawed paw through the crack. At one point, something heavy crashed onto the roof with a deafening thud. The werewolf, with surprising agility, had climbed up and was now scratching at the old shingles, searching for a weak spot to get inside. Every creak of the floorboards in the house, every rustle outside the walls made us jump and freeze, anticipating an attack. The hours dragged on excruciatingly slowly. Mark suddenly stopped in the middle of the room. "The cellar?" he said. I remember seeing a trapdoor in the floor of the pantry, the one next to the kitchen. It leads to the cellar or crawl space. It's our only chance when it breaks in here. We can hide there, or maybe find another way out. He grabbed the axe. We tiptoed into the dark, junk-filled pantry. Indeed, in the middle of the wooden floor, there was a square trapdoor covered by several old, dusty sacks with unknown petrified contents. With difficulty, we pushed them aside. The trapdoor was fitted with an old mortise lock and a couple of rusty hinges. The lock on the trapdoor was old and thoroughly rusted. A few strong, precise blows with the blunt side of the axe where the keyhole should have been, and it gave way with a dry crack. Mark, carefully holding the lid, pried it open. A stream of stale, cold air rushed out of the gap into our faces. It smelled of dampness, damp earth, and a faint but distinct, nauseating, metallic smell of old blood. My stomach clenched unpleasantly. "I'll go first," Mark said, taking the flashlight. "You wait here." He shone the light down. In the faint beam, a steep wooden ladder appeared, leading into the darkness. Mark began to descend cautiously. Emmy and I pressed close together, waited above, holding our breath. Suddenly, a sharp, creaky voice came from below, making us jump. "What the devil are you doing down here?" It was Jed's voice. Mark mumbled something in response. Then his head emerged from the trapdoor. "Come here," he whispered. "Carefully, though. He's here." I, leaving Emmy by the trapdoor, began to descend. The cellar turned out to be small, with a low ceiling and earthen walls reinforced in places with old boards. In the far corner, on an overturned rusty bucket, sat Jed. He was alive. In his hands he held his double-barreled shotgun, and the barrels were pointed directly at us as we descended the ladder. In the dim light of Mark's flashlight, the old man's face was even more haggard, drawn, and his eyes burned with a wild, feverish gleam. "I told you to stay in the house, locked in," Jed hissed, his voice hoarse but surprisingly firm. "Now he knows you're here, knows there's more prey in the house." But he killed Ben," Mark exclaimed, stepping closer but stopping a few feet from the old man. "That thing, it tore him apart." "You ruined everything." Jed didn't lower his gun, his bony fingers tightly gripping the forend. "Always you city smartasses ruining everything. You just had to sit quietly and wait for morning." His gaze was full of such hatred that I felt uneasy. What did he mean? And why was he hiding here instead of defending his home? "He's looking for food." Jed's voice suddenly broke into a half-whisper, filled with such unbearable, all-consuming pain that I instinctively took a step back. The gun in his hands lowered. "My son, my Billy." Mark and I froze, exchanging glances. Emmy, who had followed me down, gasped quietly. "His son? Billy? The boy from the photograph and the creepy drawing? So the monster, the creature that killed Ben and was now prowling around the house, that was his son? When he was 7? We lived deeper in the bayou then, on the old family plot." Jed spoke slowly, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance, through the earthen wall of the cellar, as if he was seeing scenes from the past. He was bitten by a creature in the woods. I don't know if it was a wolf or something worse. I found him that evening covered in blood, unconscious. I thought he wouldn't make it, but he survived. And he changed. The old man's voice trembled. Jed, not fully lowering the gun, but speaking more to himself than to us, began to tell his terrible story. The story of a curse that had broken his life. About the first full moon after that bite, when his small, beloved Billy, his only son, transformed before his eyes into a roaring, fanged monster. In uncontrolled, blind fury, he killed his mother, Jed's wife. She died in my arms. Tears streamed down the old man's wrinkled, unshaven cheeks, the first tears I had seen on his face. And she begged me to take care of him, not to let him be lost, to save our boy, no matter what. He fell silent, struggling to suppress the sobs that threatened to burst forth. I tried, Jed continued a moment later, his voice now hollow and lifeless. I swore to her. I moved him here, to this abandoned ranch, far from people, far from temptation. I built this barn like a cage, reinforced it as best I could. At first, I fed him livestock, bought old, sick animals from neighboring farms, but he needed something else. Over time, he stopped eating animal meat. He needed human flesh. The horror on our faces was replaced by a wave of disgust and shock. I felt nausea rising in my throat. Mark looked as if he'd been struck. Emmy quietly sobbed, covering her mouth with her hand. All these years, all these damned years, I had to lure people here, Jed choked out, each word costing him immense effort. His gaze was full of such agony that I pitied him, despite the monstrosity of his confession. Random travelers, drifters, those who wouldn't be looked for, those who were willing to work for food and a roof over their heads. I'd say I needed help around the farm, offered work for a few weeks. And then Billy got his meal. He turned his heavy, insane gaze on us. You were supposed to be next, in a couple of weeks, once you'd settled in a bit, stopped being so wary. But he smelled you earlier, too much fresh blood, too much life nearby. It drove him mad, he couldn't wait any longer. He's gotten stronger lately. Now get out of here, upstairs, all three of you! Jed suddenly roared, his voice once again filled with fury, his eyes blazing with madness. He raised the gun again, pointing it at us. Go upstairs. He'll find you there. Maybe then he'll be sated and leave me alone for a while. This is your chance to atone for waking him early with your city commotion. He made a threatening gesture with the shotgun, pushing us towards the ladder. We didn't even have time to react to Jed's insane command, nor to fully grasp the depth of his monstrous betrayal, when the cellar ceiling boards directly above our heads splintered with a deafening crash. Into the gaping hole, showering us all with dust, dirt, and splinters, it jumped. The werewolf. Huge, snarling, with burning yellow eyes, it landed on all fours, almost hitting us. The fur on its hackles stood on end. Saliva mixed with Ben's blood dripped from its fangs. It looked directly at Jed, its father, and let out a low, threatening growl that made my ears ring. Jed raised his gun, aiming directly at his monstrous son's chest. His hands trembled, his face contorted into a grimace that mixed horror, despair, and a strange, twisted, painful love. The werewolf slowly, stealthily, like a giant panther, began to approach its father, its burning eyes fixed on him. Jed screamed something inarticulate, wild, desperate, but no shot followed. His finger on the trigger didn't twitch. He couldn't shoot his son, not even this one. The werewolf lunged forward in a sudden, lightning-fast strike. Jed recoiled, stumbled over a gnarled root on the dirt floor, but still didn't fire. The creature, letting out a short, furious snarl with one powerful blow of its clawed front paw, threw the old man against the far wall of the cellar. There was a dull thud as his body hit the ground and a faint, choked groan. The rifle flew aside, clanging uselessly against a stone. Then the werewolf, without even glancing at its fallen, motionless father, turned to us. 3 pairs of eyes burning with terror met its blazing yellow pupils. Emmy, standing closest to the monster, right by the ladder, didn't even have time to cry out in pain when the werewolf's claws slashed her shoulder. A dark red stain immediately spread across her light blouse. She crumpled to her knees, pressing her hand to the wound, a strangled moan escaping her throat. Blood flowed through her fingers, dripping onto the dusty floor. Mark, reacting first, grabbed a heavy piece of board that had fallen from the ceiling and, with a furious cry, tried to distract the creature. "Over here, you bastard! Try me!" He swung his improvised club, trying to hit the monster's snout. The werewolf did indeed focus its attention on him for a moment, snarling viciously and letting out a low growl. This gave me precious seconds. I hooked Emmy, who was limp and almost losing consciousness, under the arms and dragged her towards the ladder leading up from the trapdoor. She was heavy, and I could barely move my legs, but adrenaline gave me strength. "Mark, faster! Help!" I screamed, barely holding Emmy to keep her from falling. Mark, retreating under the werewolf's assault, which dodged his clumsy blows with terrifying ease and tried to rake him with its claws, was the last to scramble out of the cellar. I was already above, trying to pull Emmy through the narrow opening of the trapdoor. Mark grabbed her from the other side, and together we hauled her onto the pantry floor. Without losing a second, Mark slammed the heavy oak trapdoor shut and leaned his full weight on it. From below, from the crawl space, came Billy's furious, animalistic roar and Jed's muffled, inhuman cries of pain. Then another thud, a crunch, and the old man's screams ceased. Silence fell, broken only by the monster's heavy, ragged breathing beneath us. "He's done with the old man," Mark gasped, leaning against the wall by the trapdoor. His face was pale, sweat glistening on his forehead. "The old man tried to buy us time with his life." His voice held a mix of horror and a dark irony. "We can't stay here." I rushed to Emmy. The wound on her shoulder looked terrible, deep, ragged gouges from which blood flowed profusely. She was very pale and barely responsive. "She needs immediate help, and so do we. We don't have Jed's pickup keys. He hid them. Or they're still on him. The highway. We need to get to the highway as fast as possible." The nearest highway we'd seen on the map was at least 3 or 4 miles away across rough, swampy terrain, teeming with who knew what else. The main thing was not to get lost in the dark. "You're right," Mark nodded, getting to his feet and picking up the axe. "There's no other way. We have to risk it." We cautiously, trying not to make a sound, peeked out of the pantry into the main room, and then out of the house through the back door, which led not to the yard, but to a small, overgrown garden behind the house. The yard, bathed in the deathly light of the full moon, was empty, save for the torn carcasses of livestock lying everywhere. The moon still shone brightly and impassively on this nightmarish scene. The sounds of struggle or movement from the cellar under the house had completely ceased. This sudden silence was even more frightening than the monster's roar. It could break out at any minute. The decision was made: run. Run as far as possible from this cursed place, from this bloody bayou. The 3 survivors, I, Mark, supporting a heavily moaning and almost incoherent Emmy, and myself, constantly looking back, expecting to see a pursuer, slipped out of the house through the back door and trying to stay in the shadows of the trees, headed in the direction where, by our calculations, the road leading to the highway should be. We moved as fast as we could, but Emmy's injury and the rough terrain slowed us down considerably. She stumbled, fell, and Mark had to practically carry her. We ran, stumbling in the darkness over tree roots and hummocks, pushing through tall, tough grass and thorny bushes that snagged at our clothes and scratched our skin. The moon, huge and crimson due to the thick, humid haze rising from the swamps, bathed everything in a ghostly, unreal light, distorting shadows and turning ordinary bushes into ominous figures. A shadow flickered behind every tree. Every snap of a dry twig underfoot echoed in our ears like a pursuer's steps. Paranoia intensified with every passing minute, with every heartbeat. Soon, our worst fears were confirmed. From the direction of the ranch, a long, blood-curdling howl echoed. No longer a howl of agony or pain, but the triumphant, victorious cry of a hunter who had found its prey. And then, almost immediately, we heard heavy rhythmic thuds and the crunch of breaking branches growing steadily closer. It was coming for us. It had caught our scent. The realization that the creature had finished with Jed, or he could no longer restrain it, and was now pursuing us specifically gave us desperate strength. We had to survive. For Ben. For ourselves. Emmy weakened visibly. She was losing a lot of blood. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. She began to babble deliriously, muttering incoherently. "Leave me," she whispered at one point when Mark stopped to catch his breath. I'm only holding you back. Go. Save yourselves." Her eyes were full of tears and despair. Mark and I exchanged glances. We couldn't abandon her. We refused, picked her up again, and carried her. But both understood that we wouldn't get far like this. It was faster than us. Much faster. When, breathless from exhaustion and fear, we finally emerged onto a more open stretch, an old field overgrown with tall grass, and saw in the distance, about a mile away, the thankfully flickering strip of asphalt of the highway and the sparse lights of passing cars, I instinctively looked back. On the crest of a small hill we had just struggled past, against the enormous crimson disk of the moon, a dark, muscular silhouette was clearly outlined. Huge, crouched low, it was preparing to spring. It was him, and it was undoubtedly closing the distance. It moved with incredible speed, barely noticing obstacles. "Faster! He's almost caught up!" Mark yelled hoarsely, seeing my frightened gaze. The hope of salvation, faint and distant, gave us the last, almost superhuman strength. We ran blindly, stumbling and falling, getting up and running again, towards the distant, life-saving lights of the highway. But the creature was incredibly fast and tenacious. Its heavy breathing and growling were now very close behind us. A few dozen yards from the saving asphalt of the highway, the werewolf caught up with us. With one giant, inhuman leap, it soared over the strip of bushes growing along the road and blocked our path. It stood before us, immense, 8 feet tall if it straightened, but it was hunched, resting on the knuckles of its front paws. It was at least 2 heads taller than Mark. Its body, covered in matted dark brown fur from which dark liquid saliva mixed with blood dripped, looked as if carved from stone. Its yellow, almost orange eyes burned in the dim light, with an unholy, primal hatred and all-consuming hunger. Foam dripped from its needle-sharp fangs. It slowly, as if savoring the moment of our complete helplessness and terror, began to approach, emitting a low, guttural growl that made the air vibrate. This was the end. There was nowhere to run. No strength left to resist. We were at its mercy. The werewolf crouched low, its muscles tensed, preparing for the final deadly leap at us. 3 students paralyzed with terror and exhaustion. Mark instinctively pushed the semi-conscious, wounded Emmy forward, trying to shield me somehow, but I understood the futility of this desperate gesture. Time slowed, stretching into infinity. I saw every hair on its bared muzzle, every claw on its monstrous paws, the glint of hungry madness in its eyes. These were the last seconds of our lives. At that very moment, as its powerful jaws were about to clamp down on one of us, from around a sharp, almost blind bend on the highway, a massive 18-wheeler truck roared and screeched out at tremendous speed. The bright glare of its headlights momentarily blinded both us and the monster. The driver, either dozing at the wheel or distracted, noticed the figures of people on the shoulder and a huge, dark creature darting onto the road at the very last critical moment. There was a deafening, dull thud of metal against flesh, like the sound of a burst tire, accompanied by a piercing screech of brakes and tires grinding on the asphalt. The werewolf, like a giant, grotesque bowling pin, was thrown off the road to the opposite shoulder, where it crashed with a dull thud into the thick trunk of an old oak tree. The truck, continuing by inertia for several more tens of yards, swerving and leaving black streaks on the asphalt, finally came to a halt. From the cabin, spewing a stream of choice expletives, a corpulent, incredibly frightened truck driver in a baseball cap with a sports team logo leaned out. "What the hell? What in God's name is going on here? You guys all right?" He shifted his gaze from the road to us, standing on the shoulder. Was that a mutant bear or some kind of giant coyote? Where did it even come from? He saw our blood-stained, mud-covered figures, trembling with shock and the horror we had endured, especially Emmy, whom Mark was holding in his arms, and his sleep-deprived red face paled. "Jesus Christ, the girl's hurt. Get in the cab quick, we need to get her to a hospital." We, still disbelieving our miraculous salvation, with difficulty pushing each other, scrambled into the high truck cab. "Drive. Please, drive away from here as fast as you can," Mark shouted, barely catching his breath. The truck driver, still muttering something about crazy Louisiana fauna, floored the gas pedal. As the truck sped away from that cursed place, I cast a last horrified and morbidly curious glance at the spot by the road where the hit creature had lain moments before. The body was gone. Only flattened tall grass, a few broken branches at the base of the oak, and a large, dark, wet stain on the ground quickly soaking into the dry roadside soil. It had vanished, as if it had never been there. It was not dead. Louisiana State Police, called by the truck driver via radio, arrived at Crescent Moon Ranch only at dawn the next day. They found Ben Carter's body, mangled beyond recognition, at the very edge of the swamps where the monster had dragged him. In the cellar of the house, under the broken boards, they found Jedediah Turner's mutilated, barely identifiable corpse. Extensive signs of struggle on the ranch grounds, numerous prints of huge, inhuman paws, and tufts of unknown dark brown hair found everywhere, all pointed to an attack by a large and incredibly ferocious predator. The official version, announced later, stated, "An attack by a pack of unusually large and aggressive feral dogs, or an exceptionally large and aggressive cougar, which sometimes happens in these wild places." The body of Billy Turner, Jed's son, like his mother's body many years ago, was never found. He had vanished into the impenetrable swamps. We gave the police confused, rambling testimonies about a giant wolf man, about a curse, about Jed and his son. They didn't really believe us, attributing everything to shock, the horror we had experienced, and the vivid imaginations of frightened students. "You kids have been through a lot," the weary sheriff told us, shaking his head. "Sometimes fear makes you see things that aren't there." But we knew the truth. We knew it wasn't just a predator. And we knew that somewhere out there, in the impassable, putrid swamps of Bayou Creek, under the light of a bloody moon, an insatiable, immortal creature roams, a creature named Billy, and it remembers our scent, remembers our fear. And one day, when the hunger becomes unbearable again, it will come out to hunt. Even now, months later, having returned to the relatively safe and civilized New Orleans, I wake up in the middle of the night to a sound, a distant, mournful howl. A howl that comes from the direction of the Mississippi River, whose murky waters carry their secrets to the Gulf of Mexico, not far from where the endless, ominous Louisiana swamps stretch. A howl that will haunt me forever, reminding me of the bloody bayou and the legacy of the crescent moon.